I would like to invite up to the podium Dr. Don Swartz. Don is with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. He has been a leader in so many ways. He's a certified pediatrician. He has a master's in business administration and health from the Wharton School and his MD and MPH from Johns Hopkins. He is such a, not only a thought leader, but a kind, humble, wonderfully committed person to the work that you're all doing. And he currently leads the foundation's effort to promote healthier, more equitable communities, healthy children, and healthy weight. And we really value everything he's done for this program. And before I stop, I just can't help but brag about the City of Richmond's great work winning the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Prize for 2017. Congratulations, Danny. Congratulations, City. Thank you to Mark Constantine for his vision in putting this in the paper today to let everyone know about the amazing work being done here locally. Thank you. Come on up, Don.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to acknowledge Jen's work in pulling this group together and today's event. So thank you and great work. It's a pleasure to be here in Richmond. I thank you all for coming out. I think the afternoon should be hopefully both stimulating and intriguing for you. We are going to begin with a conversation with Robin Hacke. I don't know how many of you know Robin. For anyone who doesn't, I hope you take the opportunity to get to know her this afternoon and beyond. You have a bio for Robin, so I won't go through the information that's in the bio. What I do want to say is that Robin has 10 years of experience in venture capital. You'll see her chops in a number of places in that bio. Included in that is experience that pivoted to work on issues around healthy communities, as I call it, and community investment more broadly, which hopefully will intrigue many of you. She has now recently become the executive director of a new center that's at the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy. It's the Center for Community Investment, which she can tell you more about, although we may have to prompt her. It's pretty exciting to us, and we are a major investor in that center, so I want to be transparent. In addition, for those of you who are involved or interested in health or public health, Robin wrote a paper that I believe is part of the materials for today that looks at how healthcare institutions are investing in community health, and I would add can invest in community health. What I'm hopeful that everybody will take away from today, independent of what sector you come from, is the common set of issues and perhaps the common set of solutions that we can all work on together that will have downstream benefits to health and education and wealth building and stronger communities and better housing infrastructure and stormwater management and whatever else floats anyone's boat. The common antecedents that we are coming to and the partnerships that are clearly necessary to get to those underlying issues are why we're here at the table. And we salute Richmond because Richmond is beginning to frame issues around inequity and lack of opportunity for people in terms of those common factors that are so essential to getting our country moving forward on all of those other downstream things that we focused on for a long time. So with that, I am really excited to introduce Robin Hacke, who I think is going to challenge, stimulate, and educate us all. Robin, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always nice to be introduced by one's largest funder. So I'm going to talk today about a body of work that I've been doing for the last 6 years in different places, in different formats. And just so I get a sense of, I saw the poll, which was helpful. How many of you primarily think of yourselves as investors? banks, investors, intermediaries, those hands? Okay. And how many of you primarily think of yourself as health people? Okay. So the goal today is to have those things be the same. Because as I can tell you as a reformed banker and venture capitalist coming at this stuff, the intersection of health and finance is really where it's at in terms of solving some really big problems that face us, I think, as cities and as a country. So I'm going to talk about a body of work that we've been doing, which really helps communities figure out how they can use the community investment system and capital more generally to work on whatever the community's priorities are, economic, social, environmental priorities. And I think this will work. Let's see. Nope. Am I going the wrong way?
Yeah, that's good. Other way. It's the one to the right.
It's the one to the right.
There you go. Yeah.
Are we good? Okay. So the oversimplified way for a reformed banker like me to understand the health challenge is basically that place matters. We all think about health access and about doctors and primary care and getting health care when we need it. But all the research that I have had the opportunity to read over the last year and a half points to the fact that really the upstream factors, the social determinants of health, the environments in which people live, are really much more critical to how health comes out for people than access to care. Obviously, they're both important. It's not one or the other. But if you look at differences in life expectancy, as I have now had the opportunity to do in many places around the country, you drive a mile and it's a 10-year difference in life expectancy. And I think what we can all say with some confidence is this is not the values that we as people in an advanced society should do have, although sometimes it kind of looks that way. So what we're trying to do is to figure out how do we make markets work in the places that obviously they're not working the way they might. And the way I tend to think about this is in our system, when a market works, then capital gets to flow downhill like water. And so gravity brings it to the places that are naturally profitable and competitive. And we do transactions that we've done before and we know how to do, and that's the natural way that things are. And when markets work, that's okay. What we're dealing with, I think, though, in many places across the country is places where markets don't work. And in those places, we really have to get over a legacy of disinvestment in order to be able to do the things that will allow people to lead healthy lives. And so the fundamental question that we're trying to figure out is if you're trying to overcome that legacy of disinvestment and make markets work, then what does that look like? And so I run a center that has this as the animating question for us. What does it really take for a city or a region to attract and deploy capital so that you can improve the upstream determinants of health? And whether that's housing or jobs or neighborhoods or access to fresh food, as Don said, you can go in kind of any door, but all roads lead to the same place. And that really has proven true in all the places around the country that I've had an opportunity to work over the last 10 years. So you can start anywhere and go everywhere. And the fact that people come with silos of money and experience is a barrier that we all have to get over. So what you can see there in the cartoon is you have some scientists who are trying to figure out some pretty complicated equations, and the middle step is, then a miracle occurs. And they are saying, well, maybe we should be more explicit in step 2. The job of our center and the job of community investment is to figure out if we do want to attract and deploy capital in places where markets are not working, what do we have to do? And so we're trying to share with you what does it take to do that. So we did a bunch of research over the last 6 years, and we talked to people in Atlanta and Chicago first, because people said, the community investment thing in Chicago, it's awesome. And in Atlanta, not so good. So we tried to understand what's going on in Chicago that's not going on in Atlanta. And what we found as we had these conversations was a very similar set of music that we would hear. You know, they were all singing the same song. And when we tried to characterize it, we said, well, essentially these folks are describing a heroic quest. And what you see on the slide is Odysseus coming back to his home. And what they were saying when they described deals is, you know, first we had to apply for tax credits, and there were not enough tax credits. And then we got the tax credits, and we had to go through some community approval process, and that was fraught with difficulty. And so they were really explaining, you know, this kind of complicated journey. And at the end of doing a transaction, everybody felt they had to rest, you know, and they would rest, and they would take a deep breath, and then they would do another one. And we thought, you know, if you look at the magnitude of the challenges that we're trying to deal with in terms of affordable housing, in terms of jobs, you know, we're not going to get there, you know, in the heroic quest model. And so we tried to understand what would it really take to think about this in a different way. And we looked at some of the transactions, and I've had the pleasure of being an investor. I ran an investment fund for a number of years that was doing community investment. And what we found was that in order to make money flow uphill to the disinvested places instead of downhill, you know, where gravity would take it, you needed some very creative structures that ended up looking like what you see up there. And this is a real deal. The victory shall remain nameless, but you know, it used pretty much every creative financing mechanism in the book. It's new markets tax credits and low-income housing tax credits and CDEs and CDFIs and all the initials that we love to throw around. And this was a win. I mean, this was a great deal. This was a mixed income, mixed use development. It served the purpose. But when you look at this and you think of the effort and creativity that had to go into it, this is not a scalable way to approach community investment, right? So what we're trying to figure out, and part of what I would like you guys to take away from today, is how do we get from doing, you know, every once in a while, a really creative deal that creates good outcomes for a small group of people that are directly touched, to something that's really more at a system scale. And what we found in the conversations with Atlanta and Chicago and the places that we've worked over the last few years is that when you see an effective community investment system that can move social determinants of health, that can move housing, there are really three things that have to be going on, and it doesn't matter who does them. And that's really key, because it doesn't matter which silo you're in, which institution, which stakeholder, you can step forward and make these things happen. And we'll talk more about what that looks like, because hospitals, when you think about it, in most places do not see themselves as part of a system, and yet they have a role to play, which we'll talk about, in every one of these functions. So the first function that has to happen is somebody has to say, here's what our priority is as a community. And it has to be articulated at a level that's not way up here, good things for all God's children, and it's not way down there, you know, we want this bodega to carry bananas, but it's really in the level in the middle that's a big enough goal so that people can find themselves in it, and an operational enough goal so that you know if $3 million landed on you, what would you use it for, right? So it's an operational thing to allow you to make choices. And you know, one place that we have seen a good articulation of that is the lovely folks of Spartanburg, South Carolina, have said, we have 600 babies a year that are born in Spartanburg. We want every one of them to be born healthy. What does it take to do that? You know, there are changes we have to make in housing and in neighborhoods and in nurse-family partnership and in jobs and all kinds of things that would contribute to every baby being born healthy. But it's an operational vision. You could figure out what to do. So priorities, and that means if you're a hospital and you have a community health needs assessment, you know, it can't be a laundry list of 400 things. You know, there has to be some set of priorities. And the test that we use for that is what we call the Martian test. Somebody lands on your city, and they don't know what your priority is, but they look at how you're spending your time and spending your money. And if they guess that your priority is what you said it is, then you're aligned. We have not found many places where that's the case. So mental note to self, you know, what are you spending your time on, and what would the Martian say? All right, so the second element, again, functional, of, you know, what needs to be done, doesn't matter who does it, is there have to be some set of opportunities, we call them investable opportunities or a pipeline, that if they were all done magically, like somebody waved the magic wand, they would add up to what the priorities are. So what happens commonly in places is we go to a place and we say, what's your priority? And they say, the priority is jobs. And then we say, show me your pipeline, and the whole pipeline is affordable housing. So affordable housing is great, but it's not jobs. And so what we're talking about here is a set of investable opportunities that add up to what you were trying to do. Harder than it looks, we get that, but it is a function of people collaborating to understand what's really moving here. And what we found again when we go around the country is that people know the deal that they're working on. They have no idea what else is happening, not in their market, not down the block. If they're doing affordable, they don't know market rate. If they're doing market rate, they haven't thought about affordable. Nobody has put that together with where we're about to dig up the streets. So lots of opportunity to use deals as sort of system events and think about how can we make an individual project add up. And then the last piece of it, and again, hospitals can play a really important role in making these things happen, is what are the policies that are either moving us or getting in our way? What are the practices of different institutions in terms of how we do business, how we collaborate, how we do things together? And what are the platforms for working together that exist over time and go beyond an individual deal? Because those factors in the environment either allow you to accelerate the pipeline or it gets in your way. So let me give you an example of what it looks like when it worked. We have done a bunch of work in the Bay Area where we tried to put this framework, the functional framework, in action. And we tried to assess what are they really doing and what could they be doing. And this gives you a sense for people who are working on affordable housing and walkable communities, what did it take? So the first thing that we saw is, there's a big affordability challenge in the Bay Area. It's probably one of the worst in the country, but there's challenges like that in a lot of places. You can't solve that challenge, 30 units at a time. And so they brought to the table unlikely actors. The unlikely actor that they brought was a transit system. So BART, the local transit system, was at the table, and nobody could quite figure out what does BART have to do with affordable housing. So, they came and they were very interested in participating, and they built trust over time. We finally got them into a room, and we said to them, what we call the denominator exercise. How many units of affordable housing are you currently developing? And they added up their pipeline, and they came to a number. And then we said, okay, now that's the numerator. What's the denominator? How many do you need? If you looked at the Bay Area and you thought about the shortage of affordable housing, how many would you need to build? And the answer was, our numerator over our denominator is less than 1% and going in the wrong direction. So 2 of the 6 people who were at this convening where we did this ended up in tears. And I went and sat with them at dinner, and they said, we used to like coming to your stuff, but this really sucks. And, how come you're being so mean to us? We're really trying very hard. And if you think about those structures, that I showed you before, they really are trying very hard, but they're not getting anywhere. And so we said, I'm studying Buddhism and mindfulness and whatever, and they listened to me. And I said, stick with it and the path will appear. And they were like, okay, she's been smoking, whatever. And the next morning we talked to them again, and we said, double down, you have a denominator problem. What are you going to do? And what they realized, and this was where the unlikely actor at the table makes a huge difference, is that BART, the transit agency, owns 300 acres of land around transit, right? If they had never been at the table, nobody would have thought about using their land. What BART said is, we have a policy, institutional policy change, that says that 1/3 of the units developed on BART land will be affordable. So then the challenge is, let's get them to think about development of that land at scale. So they looked at the zoning. They realized they could build 30,000 units of land, of housing on that land without having to ask anybody, right? And 1/3 of that, 10,000 units, would be affordable. Now that is off the chart in terms of scale relative to what the entire community investment system had been producing, and that's one of the best systems in the country. I mean, they're doing awesome, awesome work, right? But when you change the game and you change who's at the table, you change what you can accomplish. And if you think about that in terms of hospitals at the table, utilities at the table, other actors that have aligned interests, development finance agencies, ports, I mean, everybody knows their own place and thinks about who can we get. It changes the game in terms of what's achievable. So that's the message. If we look at the paper that Don was mentioning, where we thought about the contribution and the roles that hospitals can play in these conversations, what we found is that there is some really creative examples around the country of people using their assets, their land, their money. Sometimes it's investment dollars, sometimes it's grant dollars, to do all kinds of really interesting work. And Bon Secours, which is present among us, is one of the hospitals that is profiled in that paper. So what we found is that it's pretty natural for a health system to think about things first in their own walls and also clinically. So they go from thinking inside the wall clinical to, okay, we're beginning to understand that it's more than that our job is more than that. And so if you look at this chart, we've said, okay, clinical stuff is on the left-hand side, and there are all kinds of great things you can do to improve people's health by approaching the clinical stuff differently. That's not our primary focus. So let's go to the right side and think about what can we do that is social determinants, that's more about the non-clinical aspects of people's lives, and how do we think about getting hospitals involved in those kinds of activities. And then what we realized is that sometimes when hospitals talk about that kind of engagement, they think first about their own patients, which is natural. So that's the bottom right box. And they can write prescriptions for fresh food, and they can do referrals to social service agencies. And many hospitals have begun to do that kind of work. Where we're really trying to get folks, and the interventions that we focus the most on in the paper, are the ones that are not targeted to existing patients. They're targeted to the community as a whole. And that's where thinking about how do we invest in affordable housing, thinking about how do we invest in regional food systems, thinking about what can we do more creatively becomes really an interesting thing. So why would anybody do that if you're a health system? And if you're trying to engage a health system, what should you tell them about why they should care? And what we found when we looked at the pioneers who were doing this was they had a very wide variety of motivations, and sometimes the motivations were different in the same institution depending on who you asked. But they kind of fell into a couple of categories. And I put this forward because when you engage unlikely stakeholders in a community investment discussion, very often the first question is why? Why would I come to that? So for some institutions, especially faith-based and Catholic institutions, it was very clear that our mission is to make people healthier. And if we see in the research that what makes people healthier is the social determinants of health, then that's what we ought to be doing, because that is our job. And sometimes that's enough right there, which is totally awesome. And sometimes it isn't. It helps if there are nuns on the board, it turns out. The second reason is, I did it because I have to, and there are different have-tos. So in Massachusetts, they have a have-to that says if you are building a new facility as a hospital, then 5% of the cost of the facility has to be directed into the community. Now, there's a fine institutional practice change, right? And so to those of you who are thinking about requirements, that's an interesting requirement. There are also all kinds of requirements that are associated with transactions. So conversion of nonprofit systems to for-profit systems, mergers, all kinds of events that kind of give people who care about health outcomes a kind of leverage point. And have to is, often a very focusing kind of reason. The other have to is you get penalized if you're a Medicaid provider for having people readmitted to your hospital too soon after you just let them go. So all the have to's are great reasons, but they don't get you all the way. So the rest of the motivations that were on here were really kind of interesting. One of them was a competitiveness thing. So if we're sitting right smack in the middle of a disinvested community, then how are we going to attract patients? How are we going to attract the staff that we want? How are we going to minimize employee turnover? How are we going to minimize the security expenses, right? So we have an institutional self-interest in making sure that the community that we're part of is vibrant, because the days of you put up a wall and it's over, are no longer with us in many places. So there is this whole issue of, we are part of the community. We will benefit from having the community be healthier. And then there's institutional self-interest. If you come to these collaborations as a hospital, you get to hang out with the mayor and with people who have, zoning variances that you're interested in, and people who might be approving your certificates of need, all things that hospitals are interested in. And so you might want to be doing the right thing by those people because that advances your interest. And then there's also financial return, because it turns out that a lot of this stuff is actually a good investment. And so if people think about it not just as we're doing charity, but actually we're deploying capital in ways that make sense for us as an institution, then there are any number of investments that can be justified purely based on the finances. So how do investments like this drive community health? I've talked about this a little bit, so I'll just buzz through it fast. It's everything from affordable housing, which is sometimes the most obvious one, to community facilities, multi-purpose stuff, grocery stores, access to fresh food, food retail, mixed use and transit-oriented communities, early childhood, really a range of interventions. And as Don was saying, many of them push you in the same direction, and the question is, how do you layer them together? So if people are thinking in terms of systems, then you have opportunities in those deals to bring people together in ways that create benefits that each silo on its own is not going to be able to do. So let me give you some examples of ways that we've seen people approach it that we thought were kind of creative. So the layer cake is not mentioned, it's more layers than what you just ate. But what we're looking at is the fact that many of the transactions that cause money to go uphill involve blending capital from different kinds of places. Banks that have one interest, foundations that have a different interest, philanthropy that might be making a grant with a third interest, but they're compatible. And so the hospital has an opportunity to say, do we just want to make a grant, or do we want to make a grant in such a way that we can bring in 3 to 5 times as much money as we are personally putting in by taking risk out of the deal for people who have to be in a different place? So for example, if you are a hospital and you're spending community benefit dollars, and you decide instead of paying for the mammogram van or whatever health fair, that you want to be the basis, the bottom layer of an affordable housing fund, by saying, I'm going to put in a loss reserve and I'm going to prove to other people that that thing is more viable than they understood, because the history of these deals is that they really are less risky than people understand, then I'm going to allow other people to come in on top of my money and get what they need in terms of risk and return. So now, instead of putting in $500,000 of input and getting $500,000 of output, you put in $500,000 of input and you get 5x, because other people's money is going in the direction that you want and the money is flowing uphill. So we've seen some really interesting examples of credit enhancement where banks and hospitals become allies and can work together to fill financing gaps in transactions. We've seen other instances where hospitals become investors, for example, in CDFIs. Dignity Health, which is a big Catholic system, has put about $90 million of capital to work around the country in community development financial institutions whose business it is to find and structure these opportunities in ways that are appropriate. So that's a relatively straightforward and easier one. And here in Virginia, you guys are blessed with CDFIs that actually know their business, among them VCC. And so as opposed to places that have to first figure out how do you attract a CDFI, you already got one. So that makes the task a heck of a lot easier. Another thing that we've seen, for example, is a direct investment. So Hopkins, for example, put $500,000 into a Walgreens. It was Walgreens was not going to put a location into a neighborhood that was of interest to Hopkins, and they normally would not carry fresh food in a location that was like this. And Hopkins said, you know what, we will assure you that this store is going to have a certain level of return. We don't start getting cash flow based on our investment until you hit that threshold, but we're willing to take that risk if you will put the store here, hire local, and carry fresh food. So very interesting example, which has now been very successful both for Hopkins and for Walgreens, of generating a financial return while achieving some of the health objectives that were really important to that institution. Then there are institutions that are figuring out ways to use their cash deposits in credit unions, in CDFIs. There's a program called CEDARS, which some of you may be familiar with, where you can get a federal guarantee on your cash deposit, so you lose nothing, but you can get leverage on your money just by putting it in an institution that is operating in a place that you care about. So there are easier ways, there are harder ways, but many, many examples in the paper, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. So beyond what roles the health institutions can play, what roles can civic leaders like yourselves really think about? So it comes down, we think, to a very small number of actions, which are actually a lot easier than you think. And for the price of several cups of coffee, you can get going, and we found that this is a very impactful way to go at it. First of all, you need a multi-sector group that goes beyond an individual deal. And that group needs to have representation from like-minded, it's a coalition of the willing. So it's not about checking the box of, you know, I must have one of these and one of those. It's more about saying, here's what we care about, here's what we think needs to be done, who's going to join us? And that multi-sector group has to figure out very quickly with the community what is the priority and what are we going to accomplish. That act alone creates the space that we've seen is necessary to think at the system level. And that becomes what we say from transaction to transformation, to go from one deal and a limited objective, you know, that affects a very small number of people to something that really does have the opportunity to be systemic is really important. Defining the priorities, back mapping, what would it really take to solve this problem at scale? So rather than going from the bottom up, you know, here's a deal, here's another deal, thinking, okay, if we really wanted to solve the problem like it would go away, what would we have to do? And that, I think, is an important step. If you think about the denominator exercise, that's a good way to go at it. It's a wonderful party game. And then you think about, where do you have a pipeline that matches your aspiration? Where don't you? What do you have to do? There is a tendency to think that all capacity has to be grown locally. And I think one of the lessons of our work is actually whatever you're missing, somebody else has. So at the very least, invite them in as a partner and grow your own together, because otherwise you wait too long. The last piece we would say is there are choke points in every process like this. Figure out what they are and figure out how you're going to open them. Okay, so the last thing I would say is advice for community leaders. What we found is that community leaders are at one table, hospitals are at a different table, and many of the community leaders and bankers don't know how to go talk to the hospital in a way that will get them engaged. So a few kind of practical points on that. Number one is you have to understand where the hospital's head is, and there are easy ways to find that out even without talking to them. One is, if they are a nonprofit system, they're required to prepare something called a community health needs assessment. Those are publicly available. Figure out what they say. Is there a fit between what you think the problem is and what they see the problem is? That gives you at least a common basis for discussion. And then look at something, again, public document 990, Schedule H, that shows how are people currently using their community benefit dollars. And get a sense of, you know, do you have a better idea? Do you have something that's going to allow them to be more impactful? Or if you have an investment opportunity, you know, is there a way that you go in and talk to the finance person eye to eye about something that is not a grant, but rather some form of investment with a financial return? And don't forget that the financial returns that are not just interest, like health outcomes that translate into lower emergency room visits, or like lower security costs, should factor into that whole ROI thing. Framing the ask is something that we find people often need some help with. What would it take to achieve the community's goals? How does the hospital see itself in that way? How do you get introduced to the hospital at the C-suite level and not from the bottom up is an important thing. And I guess what I would say at this point is to learn more. We are the Center for Community Investment. We are on a journey right now ourselves to work with 9 hospitals over the next 6 months. We're going to be documenting the lessons that they learn as they try to accelerate and deepen their own community investment process. We will be sharing the tools and the lessons and cases from that work with the field. And we look forward, as we move forward and get smarter, to working with all of you. So I will leave it there for the moment and see if there are questions.
Close enough, since we want everyone to hear you.
Excellent. So one of the opportunities, I think, in Richmond right now is that we are at the very beginning stage of our master plan process, and this will unfold over the next couple of years. And so I guess one question is experience with the master planning process being a structure for investment pipeline, and then second, advice to this community as we enter into that master planning process of who needs to be at the table, what kinds of things should we be thinking about incorporating into that master planning.
That's a great question. So for reasons that are not clear to me, because I am not an urban planner, most planning processes are entirely divorced from the financial and investment considerations that would make them implementable. So what happens is you plan, and then you do, and the doing and the planning are not necessarily related, and the plan very often becomes shelf art. So I think the most important thing about a planning process is to be doing and planning in a more integrated way. And so you don't wait until the end of the plan to start doing, and you don't wait until the end of the plan to involve the people who are going to end up having to implement that plan. So I think bringing investors and developers and people who are going to be a serious part of making it happen into the process early enough is really critical. The reason people say they don't do that is that somehow the purity of the plan gets compromised by nasty private financial interests. But I think what happens is if you don't bring those people in, then the plan becomes irrelevant because the independent financial interests take over anyway. So I think it's a question of, are we going to have that debate in a public way with community organized and with financial people all slugging it out in a way that then allows us to move forward, or not? I'm not saying it's easy, but I think the trap that we've seen is that people go all the way through a plan and then they implement and they don't ever really implement. The other thing I would say is that there really are policies that have been proven all over the place that make a difference when you're thinking about master planning. And so the first one is, are we asking the climate question in a rigorous way? And it's very clear that in many places, low-income communities are the ones that are vulnerable to flooding. They're the ones that are suffering from heat island. And so are we taking into consideration in the planning process what the social determinants would look like for our folks? And then the second one is, are we really maximizing the opportunity for mixed use and walkable neighborhoods? Because otherwise what happens is you're at a project scale and all of the things that you could do when you're at a larger scale get lost because you implement one by one. So I think there are places that have done a good job of asking those questions early, and I would suggest it's not the easy way, but it's probably a productive way.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very, very inspiring, actually. You just mentioned something that really tweaked something in my head. I'm a big fan of mixed-use development. One of the things, however, that I've noticed over the years is that mixed-use developments often wind up being another version of gentrification. It often happens, and this might speak to the policy issue that you have alluded to a couple of times. So my question is, what sorts of policies and practices do we need to put into place so that developing a mixed-use community actually has the community that lives there benefiting from it? Who are the players we need to get involved in order to make sure that those policies and practices are established and put into place? Because if it's, again, just the community forces and hopefully some financial investment institutions and so on, that's probably not everyone you need at the table for them.
Absolutely, and I wish I had a great answer on the mixed use, mixed income thing. I think it's very much an object in motion, and people are really learning how to do it. There's a guy who used to be at HUD, whose name is Salad Verghese, who is doing a focused effort, really thinking about how do you do quality mixed income, mixed use development without displacement. Some of it is about requirements for the mix. Some of it, and the Lincoln Institute here has done some really interesting work, is about the mix of unit sizes that are allowed. And so when you think about granny flats or English garden apartments, but the mix of unit sizes in a neighborhood can really contribute to an income mix in ways that people don't always contemplate. And so thinking about density and infill in a way that preserves natural affordability is part of a solution that we've seen that's really interesting. There's a Lincoln Institute magazine called Landlines that has done some writing about that, and I think it's worth thinking about. And then the third thing, you have another one, is that very often the developments focus on the residential at the expense of the ground floor retail. And what we've seen is that this is another role for hospitals. If you get a hospital, for example, to locate doctor's offices and be a master tenant and have requirements about what goes in that building, either for small businesses that are locally or minority owned, or for affordability of the units that go in, there's an opportunity for everybody to win, because the ground floor retail is very often hard to finance, and if you can get a guarantee from an anchor institution like a hospital, it makes everybody's life better.
Do you want to mention economic development and the need for more comprehensive planning in order to get to mixed income communities?
So one of the other things that happens in master plans is community development goes this way and economic development goes that way, and they don't ever talk to each other. And so we've seen in the work that we've done in Denver and the Bay Area in LA that integrating those processes is really a good idea. And particularly integrating the way you think about small business development for residents, whether that's micro-enterprise, whether that's food businesses, which tend to be kind of interesting. That could really help keep the fabric of the neighborhood together in a way that otherwise is hard to do.
Other questions?
Last chance, last chance. All right, well, it's 1:05.
Mark?
Okay, good.
Question. Last question.
So it was inspiring. It was a very inspiring talk. I completely agree with you. But Robin, so I'm going to ask you to look in the other direction. When communities don't do this work, what are the sort of 2 or 3 most common bad practices, misperceptions, ways of thinking that stop communities from doing this work well?
So I think there are a couple of them. One is people have a tendency to default to deal by deal. And as we've said, making the system visible so that you can engineer it and make it better is a way to handle that. I think another thing is people operate in their silos. And I think this is where civic leadership, whether it comes from the public sector or from somewhere else, can really help people get over themselves, because the interests are really common when you get to the end, and so getting people to define what that looks like in a way that they see themselves in it is really an important thing. So We call it the dig once principle. You know, if you're going to dig up the street to fix the water thing, then would it be nice to fix broadband and electric at the same time? Yeah, it would be really good. And when you're fixing it back, you know, if you make a permeable pavement and you absorb stormwater at the same time, you know, extra bonus points. But you don't have the opportunity to do those kinds of conversations if everybody's in their own silo.
As we move forward this afternoon, the one thing I want to ask is, do people, with Robin's talk and how you walked into the room today, see a connection between financial risk and economic opportunity for those who perhaps have not had that opportunity?
That would be a no.
So, I hope this afternoon we can engage you in a conversation about what economic opportunity means, how investment in economic opportunity reduces the risk of investment at the community level. So, if everybody has an opportunity to learn, everybody has an opportunity for their children to learn, everybody has an opportunity to live well and have a long, healthy life, risk in that community goes down. It's led to differential investment for those who wish to only cherry pick as they invest. It's led to differential location for health systems that want to select only healthy or well-insured populations. But at a community level, there is no good approach to risk that doesn't travel through improving the opportunities for everybody. I hope this afternoon we can both lead you on that pathway, but more so, based on Robin's framework, if you haven't seen your role yet, or don't understand your role in moving your community, your communities or the state of Virginia forward on a path through improved opportunity for everyone, and planning collectively toward that, and you don't see your place at the end of the day, please come talk to us. We will convince you of why it is important for you to understand that pathway. Thanks so much for participating today, and I'll turn it back to